Good afternoon, and welcome to American Judas, the life and crimes of Benedict Arnold. I hope all are doing well as the COVID outbreak continues. Hopefully things are getting a little bit easier for you and the restrictions are not quite as burdensome, but unfortunately we still are not able to meet together in person, which is very disappointing. I miss seeing you. I really look forward to being in person with you as soon as possible, and especially with a topic like this today. This topic actually comes by popular request. A couple of you had asked me previously about the enigmatic figure of Benedict Arnold and how we can better understand him. So I missed the opportunity to be able to exchange and ask questions in a live format with you and have the normal free-flowing discussion that we usually enjoy. But at least we do get together virtually, and I hope that this is informative and maybe even a little bit enjoyable for you. American Judas. Does Benedict Arnold deserve to be labeled in that manner? We will let you be the judge as we near the end of the presentation, but certainly it's indisputable that Benedict Arnold's name has become synonymous with treachery, treason, maybe we could even say cowardice in the annals of American history. His name has literally become a synonym for all of those things. And certainly when that occurs, we are certainly within our rights to ask, did this person earn such infamy, and how exactly did they do so? And maybe even more importantly, what were the reasons for Arnold's descent into historical infamy? We'll try to answer some of those questions today. We begin, first of all, with a picture of the man himself, and we begin with a picture of him in his colonial uniform, the uniform of a major general, a rank which he was going to achieve by 1778, and one which he wore proudly until his defection to the British Army, one which he fought for vociferously, we might add. Arnold was born in 1741, so of course, still during the colonial era of America's history. He was born in Connecticut, uh, and this is an area which was very much associated with a number of very important events in colonial history. He was born particularly in the town of Norwich, and if you know much about Connecticut, it was very much caught up in the enthusiasms of the First Great Awakening. It also, of course, was the headquarters, the home base for Yale University, which was one of the celebrated academic institutions in America at that time. It was thought at one point that Arnold would certainly go to Yale University, and as we'll see in just a few moments, that was thwarted by tragedies in his life, but there was every expectation when he was at the age of 10 and started boarding school that his trajectory would be like that of many young men of means in the colony at that time, that he would end up studying at Yale University, something which, of course, does not transpire. He was born to his father, Benedict Arnold, who technically would be Benedict Arnold Sr., and his mother, the former Hannah King. His early life was fairly comfortable. His family was prosperous. His father had a merchant's business, a mercantile business, and was doing fairly well in his early years. And his mother was generally loving and supportive. He had a number of brothers and sisters. In fact, he had six, although by the time he comes to adulthood, there are only two, he and his sister Hannah, who's going to be a very important figure throughout his life. So he's going to suffer the loss of all of his siblings except one over the course of the next few decades. And speaking of loss, he came to know it very well and very powerfully. In 1759, his mother Hannah died. This really sent his father into a desperate spiral, one from which he never completely recovered. His father mismanaged his business. He began to drink heavily. He was even turned out of communion at his local church, and eventually died himself in 1761, leaving behind a broken business and a number of debts. Arnold, at the age of 10, had started boarding school, as we've said already, and for a little bit, he pursued the pre-collegiate curriculum of study. But when two of his brothers died in the late 1750s, it was felt that he needed to pursue apprenticeship for a trade. And so his mother had arranged for him to be apprenticed to two of her cousins from the Lathrop family and to learn the business of bookselling. and general mercantile work, which would be in keeping with his father's business as well. The idea was that someday he would inherit the family business. After both his father and his mother's deaths, he did inherit what was left of the business, though it was a very shattered business. In 1762, he sets himself up as a bookseller and a pharmacist, something else he was trained in his apprenticeship. That lasted for a couple of years before he formed a mercantilistic partnership with Adam Babcock, a partnership which was going to last from the mid-1760s until the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And the reason, of course, that that partnership dissolved is because their assets were seized when the British forces began to occupy the colonies at the beginning of the Revolution. In fact, the Revolution is going to be a time of tremendous personal loss for Arnold in a number of ways, as we're going to see. This partnership was fairly lucrative in its early years. Arnold sailed back and forth on voyages from the colonies to the West Indies. There are reports of bad behavior and duels, some of which can be verified, some of which cannot be verified. There are also allegations of smuggling, which we're going to see shadows of this later as well. There were allegations that Arnold would circumvent government rules and regulation in order to turn a higher profit. Part of what makes this murky, though, is the fact that by this point in history, the British government had already begun to impose their various taxes to try to recoup the money that they had lost during the French Revolution, or excuse me, during the French and Indian War. And so at this point, you've got the Stamp Act, you've got the various acts that are seeking to raise money from American shipping to furbish British coffers. You're eventually going to have the Sugar Act, and you're going to have all of these different measures being imposed by the royal authority, which the colonists actively opposed as, quote, taxation without representation. So there's a little bit of murkiness here because some of Arnold's smuggling activities could be seen to be in keeping with that which other colonists were engaging in as well to circumvent what they considered to be unfair British regulations. At least that's what he would contend later when people pointed to his previous activities and alleged that he might be continuing to do the same thing during his military service. Arnold also got married during this period. In 1767, he married Margaret Mansfield, the daughter of one of his fellow members of the local Masonic Lodge. Margaret and Arnold appeared to have a fairly strong marriage and to have loved each other genuinely as far as we can tell. But unfortunately, as you can see from the PowerPoint slide, that marriage is not going to be long. She is going to end up dying in 1775 while he is away occupying Fort Ticonderoga after its capture. As the Revolutionary War begins, it is very important to note that Arnold is an enthusiastic supporter of the colonial revolt. In fact, throughout the 1760s and early 70s, he frequently complained about the unfairness of British measures. Now, of course, we have to take into account the fact that these measures directly impacted his economic interests, something that always was preeminent in Arnold's view. He had suffered tremendous financial loss early in life. He had seen his comfortable life ripped away when his father died. And so he's always worried about that specter of financial ruin and always taking measures to try to insulate himself from that. And despite that, despite his caution in that regard, as we're going to see, he ends up suffering financial ruin over and over and over again. As the revolution started, he signs up to help lead the Connecticut militia. He had gone so far in 1770 when the Boston Massacre happened as to say, why have Americans become so neutered? Have we become a country of philosophers? Why will we not stand up and take action? Well, now is the time to take action, and Arnold certainly was eager to apply himself to the task. In 1775, in the spring of that year, he suggested to Congress that they set out to take Fort Ticonderoga. Ethan Allen and others had already begun to set out to pursue that objective as well, and Arnold was dispatched to accompany them. They did end up, of course, seizing Fort Ticonderoga, and they occupied it for several months, moving into the summer of 1775. In June of 1775, because of some conflicts with his fellow officers, this will not be the first time we see this in Arnold's career, and it will not be the last time for sure. Arnold ends up leaving Ticonderoga and heading back to Philadelphia. On his way back, he receives word that his wife has died. So he learns of his wife's death in 1775 as the war is just beginning. And he also learns that his assets are being seized by the British. And so in his quest to be appointed to a higher command, his reason for journeying to Philadelphia, he discovers that almost everything has been ripped out from beneath him. Throughout 1775, he continues to serve in a number of capacities. And in the fall of that year, he is dispatched to Canada. This is a moment when the colonists are very ambitious to take British possessions in Canada. This is an early ambition, and as you well know, it's one that's going to end disastrously. Arnold and his co-commander, Richard Montgomery, are going to attack the capital city of Quebec on December the 31st in the year 1775. It does not turn out well. The attack is repulsed by the British defenders of Quebec. Montgomery is famously killed in battle, and Arnold's leg is shattered, wounded during the conflict. This will be the first of 2 times that his leg is injured in this manner. And in fact, it already had become gouty as he had gotten older. And so this pain in his leg is going to be a constant, painful foe throughout the rest of his life, a constant aching reminder of the things that he has sacrificed on the field of battle. He is promoted because of his heroics to brigadier general, but he is dissatisfied with the speed with which he is receiving promotions. Arnold has a very high estimation of his abilities, and in fact, a lot of other people do as well. It's important to note that throughout all of Arnold's complaints and struggles, he does find a sympathetic ear in George Washington. George Washington sees something in Arnold. He does value Arnold and often laments the fact that he also feels like Arnold is mistreated. A lot of the people that oppose Arnold's advancement are the same people that later on are going to be pulled into what comes to be known as the Conway Cabal, an attempt to actually try to unseat George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. Brad Meltzer has written an excellent book recently called The Washington Conspiracy, which gets into that if you have more interest in the Conway Cabal and the attempt to try to remove Washington at the midpoint of the Revolutionary War. So there is something to Arnold's complaints. They are not completely fabrications of his own imagination. But there's also a streak of vanity and ambition in Arnold that seems almost uncontrollable. He continued to serve in the Canadian theater of the war for a bit longer, and then eventually was transferred closer to Philadelphia. It's while he's there that he becomes very frustrated at accusations being made against him. These are being levied by co-officers who feel like Arnold is suspiciously handling the resources that are dispensed to him. There are some in Congress that allege that when he is on the Canadian expedition, that his receipts that he turns in for expenditures don't exactly line up with what they actually see deployed on the battlefield. And there are some questions about whether he may be pocketing some of this money himself. One co-officer of his, one person who knew him well, said the man's God is money, and he would sell his own soul and his country to have more of it. Those words, of course, would prove to be somewhat prophetic in the years to come. Arnold's promotion was blocked several times in 1777. He desired to be promoted to Major General, and he struggled to get there. Several people were promoted over him, and he felt like it took entirely too long for him to reach the rank. He finally does receive it through Washington's urging just before one of the most pivotal battles, if not the most pivotal battle of the American Revolution. The Battle of Saratoga took place in October 1777, and this is the battle that really affects the outcome in many ways of the American Revolution. It will be the battle that convinces the French to weigh in on the side of the Americans. It is a midpoint victory for the Americans. It is badly needed during a period when they had lost many battles up to that point, so they needed to demonstrate that they could win effectively. And it also prevented the march of Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, the British commander, into New York. And so it helped preserve the northern part of New York and keep it free of British control. Once again in this battle, Arnold is injured, but not before he performs heroically. In fact, by any measure, his service in this battle is outstanding. Many historians will say that even though General Horatio Gates got the credit for Saratoga, Arnold was the real hero of the battle, and he paid for it with yet another severe leg injury. This time, the surgeons asked about amputation, and Arnold absolutely refused. He couldn't imagine life without his leg. And so he had them reset the leg against doctor's advice. It amazingly is going to turn out to work, but it is not a complete set, and it does not heal well. It will be a source of constant pain for him throughout the rest of his life. And in fact, it leaves him an inch or two shorter on one side because the legs are not even any longer due to the clumsy way in which the injured leg was set. Well, it's at this point that the ominous music begins to play, and we reach the turning point in Arnold's life and career. He is now facing the possibility of a formal court-martial, accused by the Continental Congress of misusing resources and embezzling funds. He is livid about this because he feels like he should be receiving appreciation from Congress rather than receiving this kind of censure. Washington tends to agree with him and advocates on his behalf. During this bitter period, he is reassigned to be the military commander of the city of Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia had quite a few Tory families who were still living there. Families who didn't have anywhere else to go and wanted to stay in their hometown, but who certainly had no sympathy for the colonial cause. One of those families was the family of Edward Shippen, a very rich and powerful family politically. And among his children was his 18-year-old daughter, Peggy. At least she was 18 in 1778 when she first made the acquaintance of Benedict Arnold. Previous to her acquaintance with Arnold, there are historians who allege, with some documentary evidence, that Peggy had had a previous affair with John Andre, a British officer who had been stationed in Philadelphia and who was about to become the head of the British spy ring in the colonies. Peggy's relationship with Arnold blossomed quickly, and by 1779, the 19-year-old Peggy Shippen and the much older Benedict Arnold got married. Peggy was a very strong-willed, very intelligent, and very skilled woman, to say the least. She is a pretty formidable personality, and only in the last few decades have historians really come to appreciate the importance of her role in what was about to unfold. Arnold was already bitter. He was already bemoaning the loss of all of his financial resources in the Revolution and before, in the years when his parents were struggling so much. He was angry and resentful about the fact that he felt like, or at least about his feelings, that he had been passed over and neglected by those who should be rewarding his achievements and celebrating his victories on the battlefield. And in the midst of all of that pain and what he felt like was persecution from Congress, he meets a family that treats him well. He falls in love with a beautiful woman who flatters him in every way and knows how to play to his vanity. And soon he finds himself drawn into a circle of conspirators who are forming a British spy ring in Philadelphia and connecting that spy ring to other spy rings in New York and throughout New England as well. John Andre is charged with overseeing this spy network. And through contacts in Philadelphia, including Peggy Shippen, he begins to correspond with Benedict Arnold. Peggy will both, while they're in Philadelphia and after Arnold is reassigned, convey correspondence in code between Andre and Andre's operatives and her husband. Arnold's deception and his treachery starts out small at first, or at least small compared to what will happen later. He will give the British information about troop movements. He will give them information about where known colonial spies are operating. He feeds them little morsels in order to entice them to ask for more. Arnold is sometimes portrayed as not being very intelligent, and the jury is out on that. There are a lot of questions about what he knew and how much of a mastermind he was versus how much of a pawn he was. But certainly he and Peggy both wanted to be sure that if he risked everything in his attempt to aid the British, that he would get something out of it. Arnold was never one to quibble about asking for reparations, about asking for payment. And so increasingly, as Arnold offered bigger and bigger game to his British allies, he began to ask for more money as well. And as more money was forthcoming, he began to look for bigger targets to turn over to the British, bigger targets to place in their crosshairs. In 1779, in the summer of that year to be exact, the feared Inquisition before the Continental Congress finally occurs. He is court-martialed from June 1779 to January 1780, accused of embezzling funds, accused of taking goods away from a already badly equipped colonial army, a very underfunded colonial army. And he seeks to defend himself, and he does so vociferously. He claims that, in fact, he is not guilty of any of the charges being levied against him, and that those charges are the product of jealous men who are wanting to thwart his rise, who are wanting to try to basically try to defame him and ruin his character and sterling reputation. These are the sorts of things that he says in the course of the various trials, the various sessions of the trial that ensues. By January of 1780, he is acquitted of every charge except for two very minor charges. So it looks like he has received vindication in these court proceedings. In the spring of 1780, having been acquitted of most of these charges, he now seems ripe for transfer to a new, more lucrative post. His post in Philadelphia had really been more of a placeholder sort of thing until a lot of the controversies surrounding him could be settled. At this point in the story, we're going to make a lot of connections with the story of Alexander Hamilton, and it's fitting that we do because the musical Hamilton was just released for streaming, and it's become a phenomenon once again. Well, you'll recognize some names if you're familiar with that musical. One of them is the name of Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler. Schuyler was one of Washington's commanders, and he wanted to give Arnold an opportunity to prove himself again. And so he advocated for Arnold to receive the posting at the crucial military base at West Point. West Point, of course, will be the future home of the United States Military Academy. At this time, it's a strategic fort located along the Hudson River with a huge chain going across the river as part of the river's fortifications. It is crucial to holding the state of New York. Throughout the spring and early summer, negotiations continue about exactly how and when Arnold is going to take command. And it's during this period that Arnold informs the British spy ring led by Andre that he is about to receive this command. Andre, of course, is salivating, as are his allies as well. They know that West Point would be a prime prize, and it would seriously weaken colonial defenses in the north. And so they immediately began to ask Arnold what he would accept for the surrender of West Point. Arnold negotiates back and forth, and certainly we see Peggy's hand in all of this, working to raise the ante a bit, working to raise the price a bit. She was quite good at those sorts of negotiations. Finally, they make an offer to Andre and his superiors, requesting that if Arnold surrendered West Point to the British, he received 20,000 pounds and also compensation for expenses that he incurs. Andre takes this to his commander, Sir Henry Clinton. Clinton is aware of Arnold, sees Arnold as a useful tool, but also has very little respect for Arnold. And so he sort of resists the idea of paying Arnold this much, even for a prize like West Point. They finally settle on a sum of 20,000 pounds, but no compensation for expenses. So Arnold doesn't get everything he asked for, but the 20,000 pounds is satisfactory to him. And so he accepts the deal. They continue to correspond through coded communications, and in August of 1780, Arnold is moved to West Point. Peggy stays behind in Philadelphia for a while, and while she's there, she continues to channel the letters she receives from Andre to her husband, and then finally she will join Arnold at West Point. Arnold keeps insisting that he and Andre meet and that they have face-to-face discussions about how all this is going to work before the actual handover of West Point. Andre's reluctant to do so. He really doesn't want to deal with Arnold one-on-one. He prefers to operate through intermediaries, but he increasingly sees that Arnold is not going to be satisfied until they actually meet. And so they schedule a couple of opportunities to meet throughout late August and early September. And one by one, for various reasons, each one of these falls through. As they are struggling to find a time to meet and looking towards a date when the actual attack on West Point will begin, Arnold is already involved in betraying his own post. From the moment he took command at West Point, he began to neglect its defenses. He began to remove aspects of the defenses that would be crucial in the case of a British attack. And a lot of the soldiers who became aware of what was going on simply assumed, because of Arnold's reputation, that he was simply removing these things or neglecting to repair these things because he was sending the funds and materials to his own coffers, which would make sense given some of the rumors and the allegations and the charges that were levied against him during his court-martial. Well, finally, September 21st was scheduled as the date for the meeting between Arnold and Andre. Arnold leaves West Point and meets Andre out in the wilderness. Andre had been ferried across the river by a British warship called the Vulture, and they had let him off on the shore and were waiting for him to finish his meeting with Arnold. They meet on the 21st and into the morning of the 22nd, September 21st and 22nd, 1780, and settle their plans for the final handing over of West Point, which will involve a British attack and then Arnold's surrender of the facility. Having finished their business, they get ready to depart when they hear the sounds of gunfire, cannon fire. And they realize that the Vulture, which had conveyed Andre to the place of meeting, was being attacked by a colonial ship. The Vulture tried to defend itself, but it was unable to resist the attack of the colonial ship. And so the Vulture escapes, leaving Andre behind. Andre has now got to go overland to get back to Sir Henry Clinton in New York, a very dangerous proposition, to say the least, in New York City, that is. This involves several miles straight through territory occupied by colonial forces. Arnold, in order to assist Andre, writes him a number of passes that he believes will get him through the different guard posts. So Andre leaves carrying the plans for the surrender of West Point, including correspondence from Benedict Arnold, in his boot. He doesn't get too far before he is captured by militia, colonial militia. And once they search him, they discover the correspondence in his boot, which directly implicates Benedict Arnold. Arnold heard of Andre's capture, and he actually tries to interfere. He ordered that Andre be sent to him at West Point rather than sent to anyone else, than sent to another officer. However, during the time that Arnold is corresponding with Andre's captors, word gets to the head of George Washington's spy ring, Benjamin Talmadge, that Andre's been captured. Talmadge knows who Andre is because it's his business to know who's spying on whom. Like we said, he is the head of Washington's spy ring. The spy ring was known as the Culper ring. It's worth noting that originally the ring was called the Culpeper ring. That was Washington's idea, but they later shortened it to Culper because they felt like Culpeper was too long to write on some of their coded correspondence. Always listen to George Washington. Never second guess George Washington. If he says it should be called the Culpeper ring, it should be called the Culpeper ring. But I guess that's neither here nor there. Talmadge immediately says, no, he's not going anywhere. I want to question him. I want his papers. Don't transfer him anywhere else until I get there. And so Talmadge arrives and the entire package is there. Everything needed not only to convict Andre of spying, but also to reveal the treachery of Benedict Arnold. Talmadge immediately sends the correspondence to West Point because it just so happens that George Washington and his staff are supposed to have breakfast with Benedict Arnold at West Point on the morning of September 24th. When Arnold hears that Talmadge has gotten the papers, he knows the jig is up, as they might say. And so he immediately tells Peggy what has happened and arranges to escape before Washington arrives. Arnold escapes on the morning of the 24th, and Washington arrives to find his host absent. They wait, and then they receive the correspondence from Talmadge. And this correspondence reveals Arnold's treachery. Washington is accompanied by Alexander Hamilton and several other members of his staff, and they immediately began to ransack the house for evidence. It's at this point that Peggy, a consummate actress all her life, plays her greatest role. When presented with the letters, she goes into absolute hysterics. She claims she had no idea her husband could ever do anything like that. She grabs onto their child and she weeps and screams and has all the appearance of a woman who has completely lost control. These men, given their prejudices and ideas about women's constitution during the late 18th century, don't quite know what to do. Washington and Hamilton and the others are somewhat at a loss for how exactly to deal with Peggy. And so they put her in a room to calm down, and they assume her innocence. Later on, Washington is going to receive a letter from Benedict Arnold asking that Peggy receive safe passage to New York, something that Washington is going to allow. Once Peggy escapes, as she is on her way, headed to New York, she stops off at the home of Theodosia Prevost. Now, just to give you an idea again of one of the connections to the Hamilton story, Theodosia Prevost is the British officer's wife who is carrying on an affair with Aaron Burr. In fact, they already were having that affair. And so Theodosia later would become Burr's wife and the mother of his daughter, also named Theodosia. Once Peggy arrives at Theodosia, she waxes eloquent about how she fooled Washington and his inner circle, and is gleeful, according to Theodosia, about how well her act went off, how well she was able to convince them that she had no prior knowledge of the treason. Well, she does eventually make it to New York, and she joins Arnold there. Unfortunately for Andre, things are not going to work out quite so well for him. He is going to be hanged as a spy on October the 2nd, 1780. There were many attempts by Washington to trade Andre for Arnold because Washington would much rather bring Arnold to justice than kill Andre, who he considered to be a fairly honorable person, with the exception that he was, of course, involved in this nasty business of spying. But Washington had his own spies, as we've seen. That never happened. The British did not turn Arnold over, and so Andre ends up being executed. In the years to come, the British may well have wished that they had turned Arnold over for Andre, because they were essentially exchanging a skilled and competent officer for one whose star was quickly falling. Arnold did not waste any time in transferring to the British Army and was soon waging war on his former compatriots. From 1780 to 81, he is involved in what's often referred to as the Southern Campaign, an invasion of Virginia, which chased Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia, out of the governor's mansion. He captured Richmond and caused quite a bit of bloodshed and heartache throughout the southern colonies. Some of his attacks on civilians, some of his treatment of civilians could be said to be atrocious. He continued this sort of behavior later in 1781 with the Connecticut campaign. In fact, many historians note the cruel irony of the fact that Arnold pursued some of his most brutal activities against American colonists just a few miles away from the town of Norwich, Connecticut, where he was born. In the end, Arnold's attacks aided the British effort, but they didn't aid it tremendously. And he was considered by many British commanders to be a commander of mediocre ability at best. It seemed that he had lost some of his skill over the course of his hardships and then in the course of his transfer from the Continental Army to the British Army. By the late period of 1781, by the fall of 1781, colonial fortunes are rising, British fortunes are declining. With the American victory at Yorktown in October of 1781, the war is effectively at an end in the United States, and Arnold requests permission to go to London, where he might advise British commanders, British leaders in the House of Commons, and also around the king regarding the conduct of the war. His superiors in the British Army didn't seem to mind sending him, probably in large part just to get him out of their hair. He had not been the valuable asset they had been taught to believe he would be. And so they were glad to let him go. And of course, with Yorktown happening just as he was leaving, he never returns. Essentially, the war is over, at least the military part of the war. In 2 more years, the peace will actually be forged in 1783. Arnold is going to stay in London, and eventually Peggy and their children are going to join him there, and he's going to attempt to set up yet another mercantile business. It's moderately successful. He never makes quite as much money as he did during the late 1760s. And part of that is due to his very tempestuous personality, something that he always struggled with. He always had problems with fellow merchants. He always had problems with fellow officers in the Army. So this is nothing new to some degree, but it seems like it gets worse in his later years. And of course, I'm a historian, not a therapist, but one has to wonder if guilt did not play at least a small role in all of those continuing troubles after his departure from the United States. He lives in London until 1787, and then briefly he moves his family to New Brunswick, Canada, in order to try to open up a mercantile business there. It doesn't go well. Arnold is simply not really fit for the Canadian culture. Even back then, Canadians were really nice and sorry about everything, and Arnold was just not a very easygoing guy. So then about 3 years, his startup falls apart, and he ends up moving his family back to London. It's there that they're going to stay from 1789 until his death in 1801. He had a number of physical complaints. He dies of natural causes in 1801. Throughout the 1790s, his leg got worse and worse. It was tremendously painful. And again, that had started in the late 1770s. And so if you're laying him on the couch as a psychotherapist, trying to figure out what exactly made this man do the things he did, there are a lot of possible reasons: jealousy, thwarted ambition, infatuation with his new wife, Peggy, and her loyalty to the British cause, and possibly the pain that he suffered as well. This would be enough, of course, to thwart anybody's judgment, although one could probably argue with some effectiveness, not necessarily an excuse for committing treason against one's own country. Essentially, Arnold is a bundle of potential causes for treason. But lest we excuse him too easily, there are plenty of other people that put up with similar frustrations, setbacks, and feelings of persecution, and yet never saw fit to betray the American cause so completely as Benedict Arnold did. His children with Peggy, there are 6 of them. They're going to continue to live in London. They will thrive a little bit after his death, but not before they've paid a number of debts that he still owed. He ends up dying in debt and ends up dying without his business having prospered nearly to the degree that he had hoped. Peggy herself is going to live a few more years before she dies very young in 1804. We think probably of cancer. And so Arnold's story goes from that of early potential hero, early favorite of the revolution. Despite the many detractors Arnold had, there were plenty of people that thought he was a hero, including his commander, George Washington, to becoming the infamous American Judas, a character who will always be held in infamy in American history. It is tragedy, and it is a warning to anyone who lets their ambition guide them so much that it enshrines them in bitterness and entangles them in bitterness and causes them to forsake their deepest ideals. If you're interested in learning more about Arnold, his times, his treachery, there are a number of great resources out there. There are 2 of those in particular I would point you to. One of them is Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Valiant Ambition, George Washington, Benedict Arnold, and the Fate of the American Revolution. Philbrick is always a great guide to topics historical. He's written a number of books on various topics, and this one is a very entertaining and informative read. I recommend it. If you want a little bit more academic take, Joyce Lee Malcolm's The Tragedy of Benedict Arnold, An American Life, is one worth the reading as well. I've enjoyed this time with you. I hope all of you are well. Stay well, take care, and I look forward to seeing you soon. I hope you have a great rest of the summer, and I look forward to seeing you whenever we're able to gather together again.